we have established powerful evidence over a decade of UNRWA senior officials, UNRWA leaders that I mentioned, who oversee thousands of teachers, who are providing material support for terrorism, who actually are on the Hamas Politburo. Lazzarini knows this, and he continues to employ these people. He should be held accountable criminally. There are a number of legal actions that have commenced in France, in the United States, Canada. We've documented this on our website. We need more actions. Lazzarini and the other Western officials who are compliant should be held criminally accountable in a court of law. That's what we need to see.
Hello and welcome to State of a Nation. I'm Eylon Levy. When a UN agency becomes a front organization for Hamas, a UN rapporteur runs interference for a terror organization, and the head of the UN court has a long and proven record of political bias, you know there is a threat to the international system. The international rules-based order is supposed to protect nation-states and democracies against barbaric terrorist organizations. But since October 7th, it seems so much of the international system, so much of the UN has mobilized and weaponized to try to force Israel to end the war that Hamas started, with the Hamas terror regime still on its feet. In today's episode, we're going to do something a little bit different. Joining me again on State of a Nation is Hillel Neuer from UN Watch. He's already been on the podcast before to talk about the deeper problems within the United Nations. Today he joins me to bring us up to speed on some of the latest developments of the moral rot inside the UN system. What is the evidence that UNRWA has been complicit with terrorism on a large scale? Why should Francesca Albanese be fired from her position? And what is wrong with the ICJ, the international court headed by a Lebanese diplomat who was previously a candidate for political office? Hillel Neuer joins us here in the studio for a lightning emergency briefing on everything you need to know about the campaign to save Hamas from the war it started on October 7th. Welcome to State of a Nation.
Breaking news out of Israel this morning.
Shocking hostage taking.
Hundreds of Israelis are dead.
I want to bring in Israeli government spokesman.
What happens when the 4-day pause?
How do you resolve this?
Where does this go?
Hillel Neuer, welcome back to State of a Nation.
Thank you.
Tell me, did you not feel you had enough to say in the first episode we did that you want to come back to season 2 now?
Always need to come back.
Always need to come back, because I need to be brief. There is so much that has been happening since in our previous episode we spoke about the big problems of the United Nations, why these institutions are being weaponized against Israel to try to force it to end this war Hamas started, with Hamas still in power. But a lot has been happening, and I want to understand from you, because UN Watch has been following these issues very closely and demanding accountability from the UN as well. 3 issues. 1, UNRWA acting as a Hamas front. 2, Francesca Albanese, the special rapporteur for the occupied territories and the nasty activities she has been conducting. And 3, the kangaroo court of the ICJ and the cases against Israel. Let's start with UNRWA. And before we get into a conversation about how UNRWA has been operating as a Hamas front, we have to watch this video, one of the more chilling pieces of public protest that I have seen. Ayelet Samirano, whose son Jonathan Samiran was abducted by a UN employee and UNRWA staff member on October 7th, confronting Philippe Lazzarini, the head of this organization that acts as a Hamas front, in Switzerland, wearing a t-shirt that says, UNRWA kidnapped my son. Let's watch.
De ce droit humanitaire, que ce soit en Ukraine, au Soudan, au Myanmar ou à Gaza.
UNRWA kidnapped my son, she shouts at him, with a picture of that poor man on the front of her t-shirt saying, "Where is he, Mr. Lazzarini?" And she is being booed by people in Switzerland as she speaks truth to power and demands to know, what the hell did the United Nations do with my son? Tell me how this came about.
So Philippe Lazzarini was invited to be the keynote speaker at the Swiss National Day ceremony on August 1st in Lausanne by the Socialist Party mayor. The pro-Israel community in Lausanne, the Jewish community, and Christians, there are a number of pro-Israel Christian activists in Lausanne. They wrote to the mayor, they said, this is atrocious. The Swiss National Day has nothing to do with the heaven organization that supports terrorism. The mayor refused to back down. He invited Lazzarini. There were protesters against Lazzarini there. There were Lazzarini's friends and supporters came as well. They're the ones who are booing. It's Lazzarini's friends and supporters are booing Ayelet. I went there. Lausanne is right near my hometown of Geneva. I came there with Ayelet. She stood up very courageously. UNRWA social worker was seen on video on October 7th kidnapping her son into Gaza. She had the courage to stand up in that crowd. You saw a hostile crowd. Some of those Lazzarini supporters booed her as she talked about her kidnapped son. Some of them, one lady twice grabbed her banner that she had about the picture of her kidnapped son, twice grabbed it and tried to throw it into the garbage. So a very hostile crowd. Ayelet is very courageous for standing up. Lazzarini wouldn't even acknowledge her presence. That's, for me, encapsulates UNRWA's attitude towards terrorism. An UNRWA social worker kidnapped her son into Gaza. We don't know where he is, and Lazzarini wouldn't even acknowledge his mother's presence.
Not even acknowledging or even given the basic decency of saying, okay, I'm not going to resign because I am responsible for an organization that took part in the October 7th massacre, but at least meet the parents, express solidarity, sympathy, promise to get to the bottom of it.
Oh, they wouldn't meet. You know, actually, as I was, the backstory, not everyone knows, as I was heading to this was on the lakeshore in Lausanne, right next to the Olympic Museum, as I was heading towards the stage area, Swiss police, a number of them, were waiting for me and kind of had a checkpoint where I was stopped. They called in, they said, "Notre responsable, our commander wants to speak with you." The commander came, he said, "What are you up to? I know you're up to something." I said, "I just want to meet Mr. Lazzarini." He said he cares about terrorism. I have documents, evidence of UNRWA complicity with terrorism. He said, "Lazzarini doesn't want to meet with you. Do not approach him." So in Switzerland, you know, Lazzarini and I are both Swiss citizens. I'm not even allowed to approach him to offer him documents about things he claims to care about, namely his staff, pervasive, systematic complicity with terrorism.
Which is shocking, and we have to demand accountability from UN officials. The UN isn't doing it. You are, as UN Watch. We can talk at length about how UNRWA is a Hamas front, how it has let Hamas fight from inside its schools, how it launders money for Hamas, how its schools indoctrinate Palestinian children towards jihad and sustaining their forever war against Israel. But really, the most shocking fact that has come to light lately, UNRWA staff members, UN employees taking part in the October 7th massacre, we were made out to be madmen for suggesting that there were UNRWA staff who took part in the massacre. People said there was no evidence, as if this poor woman, Ayelet Samarano, were shouting her head off without any evidence for it. But now even the United Nations has been forced to admit at least 9 UN staff took part in the October 7th massacre and fired them. Tell me what has happened now that the UN has been forced to admit that.
Well, look, we would think there would be enormous shame and consequences for the fact that at least nine UNRWA employees, a so-called humanitarian agency, they were involved in a massacre, mass murder, mass rape, atrocities, torture. You would think the head of the organization would resign. You'd think heads would roll, so to speak, at the organization. You'd think that the countries that had frozen funding back in January when this was first reported, now the UN's internal investigation is finished, and basically they confirm everything that Israel said. You'd think that countries would again pull their funding. None of that has happened. We're still in a huge cover-up, denial, other than the United States. Virtually every country, Western country, is continuing to fund an organization that is complicit with terrorism.
And yet there was such a concerted attempt to say that the UN and UNRWA had no involvement in the October 7th massacre.
Where's the evidence? Where's the evidence?
Exactly. And in fact, there was a UN report called the Colonna Report that the headlines, at least, said exonerated UNRWA and said that Israel had presented no evidence that UNRWA was involved in the October 7th massacre. What was the Colonna Report? What did it actually say? And why was it reported as saying something that it didn't?
Well, look, when the news first came out at the end of January that Israel had revealed the names of 12 UNRWA employees involved in the massacre, the UN quickly went into some kind of a spin mode, and they came up with two different things. First was the internal investigation. We need to investigate internally these 12. Separately, a UNRWA so-called independent review had been created. Actually, it was created about 2 weeks prior, initiated by Lazzarini, in response to our expose that there was a Telegram chat group of 3,000 UNRWA teachers who celebrated the massacre on October 7th in Gaza, this chat group. And it was in response to that that he had created this independent review. The UN then used the independent review to try to gaslight the world and give a bill of health to UNRWA, which actually had nothing to do with the 12. Namely, the Colonna review was tasked to investigate what are the processes that UNRWA has, the systems they have to investigate what they call neutrality violations, which is their euphemism for UNRWA staff that are either involved in Hamas terrorism or that promote Hamas terrorism. So the Colonna review, when it came out in April, it actually had nothing to do with the allegations of the 12 involved in the massacre. It was only about their systems for investigating violations. And yet the spin, certain words were put into the press release. The spin was Israel did not give any evidence of UNRWA staff complicity. And even though you had this weird thing where Catherine Colonna herself at the press conference releasing her report said those Guardian headlines that Israel provided no evidence are misleading because my review, she said, has nothing to do with those 12. That's the OIOS, which is the internal investigation. And Israel actually had no reason to give the information to UNRWA. They should give it only to the OIOS. And Israel was cooperating with OIOS, she said. But none of that made it into the headlines. The Guardian, Mehdi Hassan and others ran with this idea that UNRWA was exonerated, that Israel was not providing evidence. So there was a massive cover-up. And I have to say the review itself was a cover-up because Catherine Colonna was appointed a month before she was appointed, weeks before she was appointed. She had told Lazzarini, "You're doing amazing work. The work of UNRWA has never been more necessary." So this is a super pro-UNRWA person. She had been foreign minister of France, which was giving tens of millions to UNRWA. So she's not an independent person. Finally, the three groups that she worked with, three Scandinavian reputable research institutes that were mentioned, are all incredibly anti-Israel, pro-UNRWA groups. I'll just mention one, CMI. This group is based in Norway. Their lead researcher on UNRWA is Kjersti Berg. She is sitting on a global network, a global lobbying network on Palestine run by Francesca Albanese. They were lobbying countries to fund UNRWA. So the same Kjersti Berg that's on the independent review examining UNRWA's systems is on a global network on Palestine lobbying countries. So she's judge and advocate for one of the parties at the same time. It was absurd.
Hang on, let me understand. We see international headlines saying UN exonerates UNRWA of claims it took part in the October 7th massacre. When it didn't do that, that wasn't even its mandate. Correct. And the people manning that review had in fact pledged support to UNRWA, donated money to UNRWA, publicly defended it, and could in no way be seen as neutral arbiters. I mean, for me, really, it's shocking to see countries continue to say that UNRWA is doing life-saving work when it is clear from the example of Jonathan Samarano, they are doing life-taking work. But quite apart from the spin that was done on the Colonna review, there's still a cover-up. Because the OIOS, the independent investigation that found sufficient evidence to fire 9 UN members, hasn't actually released its report. Only a press release. So tell me, why is that? If the UN has found there is sufficient evidence to fire 9 UN staff who took part in the massacre, why are they covering up the evidence? Why can't we see that?
Well, I agree. It's absurd that the UN is not releasing the information. The world was told they're investigating. They found evidence. This is a major international issue. We're paying for it. If you live in a Western country, if you live in the United States, before the US froze money, they had shoveled out more than $100 million out the door this year. They gave $1 billion in the past 3 years. If you live in Canada, the UK, any EU member state, you are giving tens of millions of dollars from your tax money to fund UNRWA. Taxpayers have the right to know what these so-called life-saving humanitarian workers were doing. We know they were involved in atrocities. Was it mass murder? Was it rape?
So why is the UN covering it up?
The UN has given no reason why they're not releasing the report. They said member states can request to look at parts of the report, but we are demanding, as you said, that the UN show some basic transparency and tell us at least something about what they were accused of, something about the evidence that was found. They found enough evidence to fire them. The UN rarely fires anybody, and from UNRWA, almost never. That must mean there is compelling evidence. The UN must release it today, otherwise they're engaged in a cover-up.
Is that usual practice after conducting an investigation to keep it secret and release only a press release?
The UN doesn't have any rules on this. They sometimes release information if it's in their interest, and other times they don't. It's really, they decide, they kind of make up the rules.
Which is really staggering, and it's important that you are continuing to press for transparency from the United Nations. But the rot goes deeper than just these individuals who took part in the October 7th massacre. We also know that Hamas has been operating out of UN facilities, and not once has the UN reported to the IDF that armed militant groups are violating the neutrality of its facilities. Tell me more about that.
Well, look, you know, if UNRWA wants to be compliant with their obligations, they could sound the alarm when Hamas takes over their facilities and abuses what is an UNRWA school, an UNRWA clinic, to create a command and control terrorist center. We saw actually in Lebanon a few years ago in one of the refugee camps when there were various Palestinian militants fighting each other, secular groups fighting Islamist groups. UNRWA actually went on Twitter and Instagram and issued a statement saying, we condemn how militant groups are using our facilities. So if they want to...
And when terrorists took over a UN office in Yemen, the UN was able to call them out. They can't do that in the case of the Palestinians.
Well, obviously they could, they choose not to. Basically, if you want to understand...
I mean, could in terms of could not bring themselves to.
Of course, I understand. What's clear with UNRWA, if you want to understand when they're going to speak out, if they can blame Israel, even if they have no evidence, they'll speak out right away. If there's some blame against Hamas, suddenly the most they'll say is, well, we need to investigate, we need to authenticate, we need to corroborate, we need time, we need months, we need 10 months. But if there's something against Israel, within minutes, Philippe Lazzarini is there on Twitter condemning Israel, even when it's Hamas firing rockets on itself, rockets that fall short. It's only to blame Israel will UNRWA speak out. If it's something that might implicate Hamas, omerta, complete silence.
Tell me, is this normal for staff of UN agencies to also be signed up, fully paid operatives for terrorist organizations and to take part in terrorist massacres? Or is this unique to UNRWA?
To be honest, I'm not aware of any other cases in the world where a UN humanitarian agency has not just one, but several individuals who've been fired. Now we have 9 who are fired for partaking in a massacre, another 9, there's some evidence, and of course we know it's much deeper than that. I'm not aware of any other precedent. So at a minimum, you'd expect the head of the agency to resign. You know, I've been overseeing an agency where 9 of my humanitarian, a social worker involved in kidnapping, mass murder, would resign. Maybe the donors would not freeze funding for a few months, but would do so permanently. That's the kind of consequences we'd expect to see. You'd expect the donor states would be condemning this in a serious way. But since the report came out, actually, you've heard relative silence from the donor states, which is shocking.
And of course, this isn't just a question of the individuals who took part in the October 7th massacre. There is an attempt among UNRWA's apologists to say it's just a few bad apples. Even though, you know, let's put to one side, yes, most UNRWA staff members did not take part in the October 7th massacre. Most of the perpetrators of the October 7th massacre were not UNRWA staff members, but most of them were UNRWA graduates. They were products of the school system, and you have done a lot of work exposing how UNRWA schools have been indoctrinating Palestinian children. But the complicity, the overlap organizationally between Hamas and this UN agency goes so much deeper that no one can say it is a few bad apples. It is a case of a totally rotten barrel. Tell me about that complicity.
Look, let's look at the numbers. The UNRWA and its apologists, since the revelations in January, tried to put the focus entirely on the 12 people that Israel had identified. And then for months, we heard from Mehdi Hassan and others, there's no evidence, where's the evidence? And of course, in the end, there was evidence, and they fired most of them. So, and the evidence had to have been really compelling for the UN to take that step. So,
even though it's important to say, in the press release, which we got because we didn't get the full report, they didn't say they took part in the October 7th massacre. They tried to fudge
may have, could be, indications,
but
maybe,
bottom
may have.
line, when you had the press conference with the UN spokesperson and they asked them, what does this maybe, could have, maybe was have? They said, highly likely.
When pressed, likely or highly likely. And Emma Riley, who is a very courageous UN whistleblower from Geneva, who was in the UN Human Rights Office. She wrote on Twitter saying, UN doesn't fire people unless there's very strong evidence. If they fired them, that's compelling evidence. She said the press release would have been spin by the comms people, the communications people, because they're trying to dictate the headline. And of course, some of the journalists are only too happy to comply.
And to limit damage.
But indeed, in the press conference, they acknowledged that it's likely or highly likely you didn't get headlines like that. But let's look at, the UNRWA wanted to focus, say, this is all about just 12 people, 12, rotten apples, even though actually the expression is a few rotten apples spoils the whole lot. They try to say it's just about 12 people. Let's look at that, all right? 12 people that Israel had identified. Then you have 100 names that Israel gave, and I published the list on my Twitter account last week. Israel sent UNRWA recently a list of 100 names and IDs of UNRWA staff who are Hamas terrorists. UNRWA hasn't done anything about this. Then you expand it a bit more. We've identified 200 names of UNRWA teachers and school principals who regularly promote terrorism, glorify Adolf Hitler. It's on our website, unwatch.org, the case against UNRWA. Then you have the Terrorgram report, which we released in January. 3,000 members of an UNRWA teachers group who celebrated the atrocities of October 7th. So now we're at 3,000. Then you look at numbers like in 2011, when UNRWA, the teachers union leader in Gaza by the name of Su'ail al-Hindi, he sits on the Hamas Politburo with Yahya Sinwar. When he was identified as belonging to Hamas, and UNRWA was embarrassed into finally suspending him in September 2011, 8,000 UNRWA teachers rallied for this senior Hamas terrorist. They shut down UNRWA schools for months, shut down 220,000 students. So 8,000 Gaza UNRWA teachers rallied for a Hamas leader. In Lebanon today, because Su'ail al-Hindi...
By the way, that is a cautionary tale that UNRWA learned the hard way, that when it tries to push back against Hamas's takeover of its institutions, it's not Hamas that pushes back, it's the Palestinian people who rise up to demand that UNRWA and Hamas continue to operate hand in hand.
Well, presumably it was Hamas that gave the order to mobilize them, but they complied.
But this was a mass movement.
They complied, and there were no protests saying, why are you shutting down our schools for a Hamas terrorist? 220,000 students are out of school, and the people go along with it. Then this happened in 2011. In 2017, it came out that Su'ail al-Hindi was elected to the Hamas Politburo. UNRWA couldn't hide it anymore. Actually, Chris Gunnis, the then spokesman, said, I asked Su'ail al-Hindi, and he said, no, he's not with Hamas.
Oh, that's all right.
Yeah. So their response was still denial, because in 2011, after the protests, they reinstated him. 2017, they finally asked him to resign. They didn't fire him. They asked him to resign. There were parties celebrating his 27 years with UNRWA. He went on to become one of the senior overt Hamas leaders, part of the Great March of Return, and was involved in planning the massacre, sitting now in Turkey. Then you go today in Lebanon. Okay, that's one UNRWA leader, Su'ail al-Hindi. Let's go to another UNRWA leader, because Philippe Lazzarini is the Swiss face who does the fundraising, but the real UNRWA leaders are Su'ail al-Hindi, Hamas, and in Lebanon, Fathi al-Sharif, head of the teachers union in Lebanon, overseeing 39,000 students.
The Lebanese teachers union or the UNRWA teachers union?
The UNRWA teachers union in Lebanon.
Who is the head of the UNRWA teachers union in Lebanon?
Fathi al-Sharif. You can go on his Facebook page. We have links to it on our website. And you will see that for the past 10 years, he regularly promotes Hamas terrorism. He goes to Hamas rallies. He celebrates Hamas terrorist acts. When he makes a wedding celebration for his sons, the leading Hamas officials of Lebanon, those who are working with Hezbollah and Iran to plan the massacre, they are in the front row of his family gatherings. He's a senior Hamas terrorist, reported Lebanese media. UNRWA was given information that he went to Turkey to meet with Hamas terrorists. Finally, UNRWA was embarrassed into suspending him in March. Same thing. Hamas mobilized thousands of UNRWA teachers, went to Beirut, shut down UNRWA for 3 months. Not reported in the press. UNRWA was shut down for 3 months. Philippe Lazzarini in June, end of May, had to fly to Lebanon, met the Lebanese prime minister, said, UNRWA is being shut down. What are we going to do? Philippe Lazzarini meets with the coalition of terrorist groups, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, other so-called rejectionist terrorist groups, meet with Philippe Lazzarini, and they reach an agreement. We learn on Saturday, June 1st, the terrorist groups that had called the strike for 3 months are ending their strike. The strike is ending on Monday, June 3rd, and some kind of positive result has been established with Lazzarini, something that is satisfactory. We can end our strike. And according to one report, Lazzarini was unsuspended. Sorry, that al-Sharif was unsuspended. Lazzarini, confronted by AP in Geneva, said, no, he's still suspended. But since March, when all of this is public information, until now, we're in August, he hasn't been fired. So we know that he is supporting terrorism on Facebook. By the way, he has thousands of Facebook friends. Many of them are UNRWA people. All of UNRWA Lebanon knows that he is a senior Hamas official promoting terrorism. He's not fired. He is the reigning head of the UNRWA Teachers Union in Lebanon. UNRWA either cannot or will not fire him. These are the true leaders of UNRWA, senior Hamas terrorists. Suhail al-Hindi in Gaza, Fathi al-Sharif in Lebanon. On our website are all the photos.
Philippe Lazzarini heads an organization that is an integral part, not only of the Palestinians' forever war against Israel, but of Hamas's military machine. What sort of sanctions do you believe should be taken against Mr. Lazzarini? For my part, I think he needs to stand trial for aiding and abetting terrorism.
Look, I agree with you. We have established powerful evidence over a decade of UNRWA, not just UNRWA teachers and school principals, but UNRWA senior officials, UNRWA leaders that I mentioned, who oversee thousands of teachers, who are providing material support for terrorism, who actually are on the Hamas Politburo. Lazzarini knows this, and he continues to employ these people. They're being funded. In some cases, they are, if they retired. By the way, UNRWA didn't fire Suhail al-Hindi so he could get his pension and not to embarrass him. Hamas says, you cannot embarrass us. If you suspend them, we will mobilize thousands to say that he's a patriot. That's what all these protests were saying, is that Fathi al-Sharif is a great patriot for belonging to Hamas. So Philippe Lazzarini knows this. He should be held accountable criminally. There are a number of legal actions that have commenced in France, in the United States, Canada. We've documented this on our website. We need more actions, and Lazzarini and the other Western officials who are compliant should be held criminally accountable in a court of law. That's what we need to see.
And I'm struggling to understand why this campaign isn't making greater headway, because you present to Western diplomats evidence of UNRWA's complicity with Hamas, how Lazzarini has been liaising and fraternizing with terrorists, how they fight out of UNRWA schools while the UN does not report violations of their neutrality, how they launder money for Hamas to be able to use, how they employ terrorists on a mass scale, including some who took part in the October 7th massacre. And yet most countries, apart from the United States, have switched the funding tap back on, saying that UNRWA is doing life-saving work, claiming it is the only organization that can deliver aid at scale, forgetting the fact it isn't delivering aid at scale at all, because it's letting aid rot in the sun on the Gazan side of Kerem Shalom, because it isn't coming to pick it up, not since it lost its Hamas police protection. But I'm wondering, when you speak to Western diplomats behind the scenes, what are they saying? How do they justify their continued support for an organization that is entirely complicit and colluding with Hamas's terrorism?
Well, look, first I want to say, you mentioned that UNRWA claims to be a humanitarian agency. The truth is that if it were a humanitarian agency, we would have no objections, because Palestinians who are in need should get everything they deserve. The problem is that UNRWA's true essence, its raison d'etre, is not humanitarian. Its raison d'etre is to dismantle Israel. Palestinians are told throughout the region in UNRWA schools that you have the right of return, and we know what the right of return means. We saw it on October 7th. It means violent, brutal assault on Israelis to massacre people, to undo Israel. That is what UNRWA teaches Palestinians, and it has nothing to do with a humanitarian mandate. If UNRWA would shed its political agenda to undo Israel and would just about distributing food, we'd have no problem with it.
Except most of its staff members simply are not humanitarian aid people. It is an organization that exists to educate, I would say indoctrinate, and therefore most of its staff are health and education, not actually aid distribution. People say, well, who else is going to distribute aid if not UNRWA? And the answer is, well, who distributes aid in the rest of the world? Does Congo have its own UNRWA? Does Sudan have its own UNRWA? No, there's a World Food Program,
UNICEF for children, World Health Organization on health issues. The UN, miraculously, the UNHCR for refugees around the world, miraculously, the UN is able to help tens of millions of people around the world in emergencies within days, within weeks, to send food into Sudan and other parts around the world. But somehow, in a tiny space of Gaza, the only one who can do it is UNRWA. It's absurd. Look, you asked me, what do Western diplomats say? I'm going to share with you one story. I don't want to name the country, but it was a large Norwegian-speaking country in Europe. And I went there and I met one of the leaders of their foreign ministry, and I came with the evidence about UNRWA. And his ready response was, but this is just a few people. There's 30,000 UNRWA people. It's a 0.0. He had the number in his head. It's 0.004%, and the rest are all kosher. So they have these
halal in this case.
Halal in this case. They have these spin lines ready. They are not really reading what we're saying and taking it seriously. They're not listening to it. We had an Australian.
I know they're spin lines, but why do you think they are not listening? Because this is their money. They are taking money from the taxpayers of this Norwegian-speaking state and giving it to an organization that colludes with terrorists. UNRWA funding is a subsidy to terrorism. Why do they not care that that is where their aid money is going?
I don't know the reason.
Give me the charitable and the uncharitable interpretations.
All right, thank you. The charitable interpretation is that if UNRWA were to disappear, let's say in Lebanon, you'd have problems of stability in Lebanon because the Lebanese people are not interested in integrating the Palestinians, which is a whole question about the apartheid system that's existed for Arabs who've been living in Lebanon for 75 years and yet don't have the right to work and don't have the right to live in certain places.
And whose parents were born in Lebanon and whose grandparents
in many cases. That's right. If this were to happen in any other country, that would be institutional racism.
I mean, let's talk what we're talking about. Palestinians who are born in Lebanon, 3-4 generations, are barred from specific professions. I mean, there are legal restrictions on what they can do.
Where they can live, what they can do. I mean, it really is institutional apartheid. Even Amnesty International, about a decade ago, documented much of this discrimination. Even Amnesty International, but this is largely ignored. And, if you go in Jordan, so the charitable interpretation would be that you may have some diplomats who say, look, we just care about stability. It might cause instability in Lebanon. In Jordan, there are 2 million descendants of Palestinians who hold Jordanian passports. So they're this weird thing, this odd thing of citizen refugees. They are citizens of Jordan, and yet according to the UN, they're refugees. And King Hussein might be telling Western countries, look, if you flip the narrative that I tell them now is one day you're going to go and dismantle Israel. So, don't make trouble now in Jordan. If they're told, actually, no, you're going to stay in Jordan, actually, the majority of people in Jordan are Palestinian descent. So the whole Jordan is Palestine thing might come up. And
So essentially the charitable interpretation is countries are continuing to fund UNRWA because they fear rocking the boat would undermine stability in the Middle East.
That's the charitable interpretation.
And the uncharitable interpretation.
The uncharitable interpretation.
Because I don't find that particularly convincing.
Yeah, the uncharitable interpretation is that the institutions of government in all of our Western donor states know very well that the whole point of UNRWA is to dismantle Israel, and that there are individuals in governments around the world who have a problem with sovereign Jewish state in Israel, have a problem not with 1967, the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, but with the very existence of the state of Israel, because UNRWA is about undoing the state of Israel. It's against the two-state solution. The whole message of UNRWA is not two states. It's that they have the right to undo Israel, and that our own Western states have a lobby around the world that is uncomfortable with the idea of sovereign Jewish state and wants to keep funding an organization whose very mission is to undo Israel. It's a very unsettling premise. It's a very unsettling thought, and that's why I think no one really wants to address it. It's an elephant in the room.
Well, let me suggest perhaps another interpretation from my own conversations with diplomats is that even those who do not want to undo the state of Israel and explicitly support UNRWA's campaign for quote-unquote return and this forever war against Israel, are West-splaining to the Palestinians. They don't think that they actually mean it when they talk about from the river to the sea. They think that by funding UNRWA, they are giving the Palestinians a bargaining card with which to come to the table and demand a final status resolution for a two-state solution. And they don't think that they actually mean it. They think that this is all for show, for leverage, and that push comes to shove, well, at least the Palestinians will have some leverage to demand their terms in a two-state solution. Deeply disturbing updates that you've brought for me about UNRWA, but I want to pivot. Talk to me about Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur for the Occupied Territories. What has she been doing, and why are you trying to get her fired?
So Francesca Albanese, first, her mandate is something that we should talk about. Her mandate, officially, her title is Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Palestinian Territories. There's only about a dozen UN Human Rights Council investigators on a particular region. of that dozen, I don't think the Palestinian territories deserves a special investigator, but if there is one, let him or her investigate whoever has done something wrong, whoever's been a victim, whether actions by Israel or Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Fatah, and all the rest. Actually, if you read her mandate, established in February 1993, it is to investigate, quote, Israel's violations. So her mandate is only to investigate Israel, and that is why legally her mandate has nothing to do with Palestinian violations. So her mandate itself is bad. But let's put that aside.
And that's just one example of how so many of these UN institutions are rigged against Israel.
From the very beginning.
You put bias in, you get bias out.
And actually, it's interesting because a number of the rapporteurs in the 90s, when there were the Oslo Accords, said, wait a minute, actually our mandate is wrong. Several, and we've documented on our website, we have a report called Mandate to Discriminate. Several of the rapporteurs in the 1990s, including one from Switzerland, René Felber, another one from Finland, said the mandate is biased. They asked the council to change it. The council wasn't interested in changing it, which is dominated by the PLO and its dictatorship supporters.
Right, Human Rights Council is really, the Council for Inhumane, whatever the opposite of rights is.
Yeah, it's the Human Wrongs Council. If it's human at all, it's a Human Wrongs Council. But Albanese, so that's her mandate. But let's talk about Albanese. Of all the rapporteurs we've had, it's amazing that I'm saying this, but I never thought there would be someone worse, because we had Richard Falk, who's a 9/11 conspiracy supporter and an open Hamas supporter. But Francesca Albanese is, in my opinion, the worst we've ever had in 31 years of its existence. Why do I say that? She is someone who not only overtly supports Hamas, because Richard Falk did that too, but Richard Falk said we should support Hamas because Hamas really wants a ceasefire. She doesn't talk about that. She told a Hamas conference in November 2022, you have the right to resist. So you have a UN human rights expert openly telling the terrorists you have the right to resist.
And of course, Hamas understands resistance as being gang rape and burning little children up.
That's right. And she knows what resistance means to them. It doesn't mean standing with a sign.
It's not even a dog whistle.
It's not even a dog whistle. So we have the ultimate wolf in sheep's clothing, claims to be a United Nations human rights expert, couldn't have a better halo effect than that, openly legitimizing and encouraging Hamas terrorism.
And so often when you see headlines saying UN experts conclude, this is Albanese.
That's right.
She's
the one writing these things. That's right.
Even when the official bodies that are responsible for determining whether or not famine exists are saying there is no famine, food security has improved in Gaza, she is the one who will generate a headline saying, oh, well, actually, there is famine in Gaza. Not based on the official metrics, but simply based on her own utter anti-Semitic loathing for Israel. So tell me why specifically now you're trying to get her fired.
So, we've been, from the day that she was appointed, we sent the file to the UN, the dossier on her background. We know that in 2014, she had said that America is subjugated by the Jewish lobby. So open anti-Semitism. America is subjugated by the Jewish lobby. She wrote it in a fundraising post on Facebook, where it was an open letter to the head of her diocese, the archbishop of her diocese in Italy, in the town in Italy that she comes from. And she said she's writing to this Catholic spiritual leader, and she's saying, I need you, Don Antonio, please support UNRWA. Tell everyone to support UNRWA. And by the way, America is subjugated by the Jewish lobby, and Europe is subjugated by Holocaust guilt. So this is someone who has been long engaged in Holocaust inversion. She repeatedly equates the Palestinian plight with what the Jews suffered in the Holocaust, equates Palestinian children with a Jewish child in the Warsaw Ghetto. So clearly, for her, for years, Israelis are Nazis. So that we knew about. The moment she was appointed, she continued to support Hamas, continued to support anti-Semitism. Just a few days ago, she had a picture of Israel's prime minister, of the picture of Adolf Hitler. So this is a recurring theme. So this is the reason why she should be removed. But in addition to that, we have brought, you could say, procedural objections to her activities, things that are really not kosher. In November, she went on a trip to Australia. Okay. Now, why is the UN expert on Palestine going to Australia? Even if we accept her mandate to investigate Israel's violations, why is she going to Palestine? The UN actually... To Australia. The UN in the past year or two has said that there's a liquidity crisis. They don't have any money. If you come to the Human Rights Council for the past year, the escalators are shut down. They make diplomats walk up, even when it's hot in the summer, walk up several flights of escalators because...
I feel there's a metaphor in there somewhere, and I'll work out what it is.
Because we have no money. right? So the UN is telling everyone we have no money at the Human Rights Council. Several UN human rights investigators on compelling issues in Yemen and other parts of the world don't have staff that they can hire because they have no money. Yet somehow the UN had money, we're told, to pay for the UN expert on Palestine to fly to Australia. No connection. She went there to give the Edward Said lecture, as a famous anti-Western, anti-Israel intellectual from Columbia University. She went to give the Edward Said lecture, sponsored by a pro-Hamas lobby group called the Australian Friends of Palestine. There's a whole pro-Hamas network in Australia that brought her. She did a series of lectures across Australia. $20,000 the trip cost at least. We asked, who paid for it? Because the lobby group said we sponsored her trip. One group said we sponsored her trip to Australia. The other group said we sponsored her trip to the other cities in Australia.
Is the problem that she accepted sponsorship, or that she accepted sponsorship from this group?
Both. There's two parts. One is she's not supposed to accept sponsorship from anyone, and certainly if you're accepting sponsorship from a openly pro-Hamas group that basically supports October 7th. Secondly, the UN, she said the UN paid for it, but again, why is the UN paying for a trip that has nothing to do with her mandate to go on a lobbying trip in Australia? She also went to New Zealand on this trip. She met with the leading pension fund in New Zealand, and we have the minutes because that pension fund published the minutes where she urges them, she lobbies them to divest from Israel. The UN has no legal right to fund that kind of trip. So she's stuck in a quandary. We asked her to show the receipts. It's been, almost a year. She won't show receipts. We know that she took her assistant with her, Sarah Troyan, who's at Erasmus University. Albanese said that she fundraised to pay for the travel of Sarah Troyan. Who paid for it? Who contributed for it? Was it the pro-Hamas groups? They won't disclose it. We've made demands to Erasmus University, a Netherlands state-funded institution, to give out the names of who funded her trip. She's not giving any information. So there's complete stonewalling about who's funding her.
Deep financial improprieties, but I'm wondering specifically about the bias in the performance of her mandate. You're not the only ones calling her out. She has also been called out by other states for her horrific abuse of her already horrific mandate. Tell me who's been calling Francesca Albanese out.
And first, I do want to mention that the UN announced that there's some kind of investigation. I wrote to the Secretary General demanding an investigation. I received a reply by the famous OIOS, Office of Internal Oversight, Investigations Department, gave me a case number, said they referred it to the High Commissioner. Then we heard that it was given to the Coordinating Committee of Special Procedures to investigate her. So there is some kind of investigation going on. The problem, Eylon, is that the Coordinating Committee is made up of her peers, some of the most radical anti-Israel, pro-Hamas, including the rapporteur on health, who's a nutcase from South Africa. I can't pronounce her name, but she's a very odd person. So the people running the investigation are her own radical peers. Now,
just a cover-up from beginning to end.
It's going to be a cover-up, sadly. But you asked me, remind me the question again.
Who else has been calling out Francesca Albanese? It's not only the great Hillel Neuer.
No, thankfully, France and Germany condemned her for anti-Semitism. This is the first time in the history of the United Nations that a human rights expert was condemned by France and Germany.
Specifically over what
for anti-Semitism. Macron, the president of France, had said that October 7th was the worst anti-Semitic massacre since the Holocaust. She had the chutzpah, the audacity, to challenge Macron on Twitter. And she said, no, Mr. President, I disagree with you. Nothing anti-Semitic about October 7th. It was a response to Israeli oppression. That angered France. It's rare for the French Foreign Ministry to respond in this way. They responded to her. They said it's revolting what she said, despicable that she would challenge the anti-Semitism of October 7th, and especially for a UN person. Germany chimed in as well, publicly on Twitter, and called her out as well for anti-Semitism. Germany and France. The US Special Envoy on Anti-Semitism has also condemned her for anti-Semitism. And most recently, and most interestingly, finally, we've been pushing for this, the United States Ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas Greenfield, posted on Twitter. She said, Francesca Albanese is not fit to hold this position or any other position at the UN. So that is an important statement. My question to the US and its allies, you've said now that she's not fit. What are you going to do about it? She needs to be removed. There's no actual procedure, but guess what, Eylon? There was no procedure to remove Iran from the UN Women's Rights Commission, but the United States led an initiative to pass a resolution, kick them off. I'm asking the United States, we've drafted the resolution, bring forward a resolution by the Human Rights Council, kick Francesca Albanese out of the UN.
That would be positive development. But Francesca Albanese is not the only UN official who has been guilty of appalling bias and weaponizing her position for the war against Israel. We also need to talk about the International Court of Justice. Yes, it has the word court in it, but it is a UN body. It is a political body as well, and there's no way to dodge it and claim that it is some independent judicial body. It is a political body of the United Nations. South Africa, of course, is pursuing this obscene claim accusing Israel of genocide. There was the advisory opinion as well that said that Israel's presence at the territories was illegal. And all this is being headed by a former Lebanese diplomat by the name of Nawaf Salam. Tell me, who is Mr. Salam?
Nawaf Salam is the former Lebanese ambassador to the United Nations. He had the position for about 10 years. Lebanon is not only an Arab state that is officially at war with Israel, it's not only a state from which thousands of rockets have been fired for the past 10 months at Israeli cities, emptying out
7,000 rockets, Hillel. 7,000. It's amazing. Second Lebanon war was only about 3,500, 4,000 rockets. Now we're looking at more rockets and drones than the whole of the Second Lebanon war.
And what has been the impact on Israeli people in the north?
60,000 people have been displaced from their homes. They can't go back.
So that country, which is dominated by Hezbollah, it's not that Hezbollah is just a piece of it, but they have free reign to do whatever they want. They are the dominant force in Lebanese politics. The representative of that country is sitting on cases against Israel, including this ICJ case accusing Israel of genocide. You know, I used to be a lawyer in New York before I took over UN Watch. And if I would go before a judge and the head of the court was someone who for 10 years said that my client was a terrorist, because Nawaf Salam is on record, we uncovered UN archives, audio, video, text of his speeches over 10 years. We found that routinely he accused Israel of war crimes, of its leaders of being terrorists. He voted against Israel 211 times, voted for Iranian-backed resolutions. He didn't just vote against Israel, by the way. He also voted repeatedly against victims of the worst dictatorships. When there were resolutions to hold the Ayatollah evil regime to account for their abuses, 11 times he voted with the Ayatollah regime.
Well, that makes sense. Lebanon is an Iranian puppet state.
That's right. He also voted against the victims of Belarus, voting with the Lukashenko regime. He was on the Security Council and blocked action against Bashar al-Assad, committing genocide against its own people. He tweeted that Fidel Castro, a brutal murderer who killed the father of my friend Rosa Maria Paya, her father Oswaldo Paya was the leading Cuban dissident. So Fidel Castro, murderous dictator for 60 years, he was praised by Nawaf Salam as an iconic leader of our time.
I mean, it's
so
clear
he's
that
the head
Nawaf
of the
Salam,
International Court of Justice.
It's clear that Nawaf Salam is not an objective figure, and that contaminates the whole ICJ. In any ordinary court, a judge who has proclaimed himself against the defendant would have to recuse himself. The trial would be thrown out as a mistrial. The court itself would be shut down as a massive miscarriage of justice. And I'm wondering, when it is so obvious to everyone that the head of the ICJ is not some brilliant neutral legal scholar, but a political actor. I mean, he even ran for Prime Minister of Lebanon while
he said that he wasn't officially a candidate, but we know that he didn't stop the candidacy. Initially, Hezbollah opposed his candidacy, but afterwards, according to news reports, Hezbollah was okay with Nawaf Salam's candidacy while he's sitting on the court. While he's sitting on the court, he's running to be Prime Minister of Lebanon. I mean,
and is backed by Hezbollah.
And eventually backed by Hezbollah. You couldn't make this stuff up.
No, but this is an example of reality being more twisted than anyone can imagine. You have the ICJ ruling against Israel, headed by a former Lebanese diplomat who is on record attacking Israel, who was a candidate for prime minister supported by Hezbollah. I mean,
while he's sitting on the court.
While he's sitting on the court. When the evidence is so overwhelming against it, I mean, it's obvious why Israel doesn't take this court very seriously. Why do other countries, why do they continue to pretend that the ICJ is this neutral legal organization instead of saying, come on, this is a kangaroo court?
Look, sadly, the UN is too often a political game where the diplomats just go along to get along. Sadly, we saw two UN figures, the former French ambassador, the former Swedish foreign minister, went on Twitter to praise Nawaf Salam as someone they used to respect as a wonderful colleague, didn't address any of the evidence that he is completely biased and disqualified from sitting as court president. They just said he's a wonderful guy. So sadly, these are diplomats who go along with the system, who get rewarded. It's a beautiful life if you're a diplomat in Manhattan representing France or Sweden. You have a beautiful penthouse in New York. You have a tax-free life. You go on to become an international hero. Maybe you're president of the Human Rights Council. If you're in Geneva, you get to be in the Swiss Alps every weekend. It's a wonderful life. It only requires that you turn a blind eye. Not all of them. There are some diplomats who do great work, and I salute them. But too many of them just go along to get along. It's rather despicable.
Hillel Neuer, you've been doing such important work trying to hold the United Nations to account. I know it's a thankless task. You must feel like you're, pushing this rock up a hill, Sisyphus style, trying to demand accountability. But so important to continue demanding accountability, speaking truth to power. Really enjoyed this episode talking about UNRWA, Francesca Albanese, the International Court of Justice, and the way that these institutions that pass themselves off as being neutral are being actively weaponized against Israel in a way that I think really undermines the whole idea of global governance and international institutions. Hillel Neuer, thank you for coming on State of a Nation.
Thank you, Eylon.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode of State of a Nation, a special briefing by Hillel Neuer, the Executive Director of UN Watch. As always, if you enjoy these episodes, please follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever else you get your podcasts. Give us a like, give us a 5-star review, share the link with any friends who need to keep up to speed about what is happening in Israel around the world. I'm Eylon Levy, and thanks for joining us.